So Akiba Rubinstein was born in the 1880s in Stawisky, Poland, and came from a Jewish background. And he was a very well-known player for his technical play and very logical and straightforward kind of play. And I think as modern chess players, we can learn a lot of things from these old masters. And also, I think nowadays we underestimate how good these players were. But in this game that I'm going to show you today, we can see that how Rubinstein's play was very logical and very modern. Actually, it's where he managed to get a slight advantage in the opening and built that up, offered the correct piece exchanges, improved his position until White couldn't hold much longer. So I think that Rubinstein is a player that is often forgotten because Capablanca is kind of the player known for his technical prowess and logical play. In the way that we say Capablanca's play kind of made it look easy, I think that we can also say the same from Rubinstein. And so I really want to shed light on Rubinstein as a strong player. I've also been reading this book on Akiba Rubinstein's games, and it's been very enlightening about how his play developed throughout his career. And so yeah, let's get right into the game. So this game was played against George Salwe, who was a chess master also, I believe, in Lodz, if I'm not mistaken. And in this game, e4 was played, e5, knight f3, knight c6, and bishop c4, so the Italian game. But in this period, of course, theory wasn't as well developed. But Black plays very logically so far with bishop c5, and now knight c3, which is definitely not the main move, but it just develops towards the center and is very logical. So now knight f6. White opens up the bishop's diagonal with d3, and now Black does the same with d6. And White decides to play the first interesting move, bishop e3, which intends to exchange the bishops and says that now if you take on e3, then I will open up the f-file for potentially my rook to gain activity there. So here, best is probably not to take, but it's also possible just to castle and allow bishop takes c5 and the doubling of these pawns, because now Black has control over the d4 square. But this is a very an idea probably that wasn't known at this time, so it's very understandable why Rubinstein wouldn't go for this. And also, the move that he played in the game is also very logical, bishop b6, which just intends to open up the a-file in case of the exchange on b6, which would be very nice for Black. So queen d2 was played, which clearly intends long castling. And instead of just simply castling this position, Black kind of waits on doing that so that they can also have the flexibility of castling long by activating their bishop with bishop g4. So now there's a potential threat of bishop takes f3, but maybe if provoked, and only if provoked. So now knight g5. So White kind of goes aggressive and attacks f7, and it kind of frees the f-pawn to be able to advance to f3 and kick the bishop away. So if Black were to castle now, then f3 followed by g4, for example, bishop g6, and even h4 would give White a very strong initiative. So instead, Black decides to play bishop h5 and defend f7 this way, and also prophylaxis against f3. So now f3 was played. But just in time for g4, Black decides to play h6 and kick the knight away, and so the knight is kind of forced to this awkward h3 square. And so here it's probably best, objectively, to take on e3 and to put a knight on d4 here, attacking c2. And if White were to castle long, then it would run into c6, followed by Black gaining initiative on the queen side here and going for a quick attack. But instead queen d7 was played, which is also very logical to first off threaten bishop takes f3, since the knight on h3 is kind of loose, and also prepares long castling. So now knight f2 was played, and now Black decides to stick a knight on d4, and in this position it also opens up the possibility of c6 to control the center. And White makes a questionable decision here, bishop takes d4, but it's also understandable because in this position there is also the potential threat of bishop takes f3, gf3, and then knight f3 with a fork. So it's not that easy. And so White decides to take on d4, but now this gives Black the bishop pair. And after bishop takes d4, it's actually a very strong bishop because it's on this diagonal, cutting through this diagonal, since now the move f3 has been provoked or has been played. And so this kind of weakens the diagonal and makes this bishop such a good piece. So now White plays the move knight cd1, which is very slow. It underdevelops, but it has a very straightforward idea of playing c3 to kick the bishop away. But seeing how this knight is important to control the center, and it's now left his duty, black strikes in the center with d5. So now if you take on d5, then after knight takes d5, it's clear that the dark square weaknesses are just too much. So you can't really do that. White maintains attention bishop b3. But now after black decides, or Rubinstein decides to castle, they've just managed to get their king to safety, get a nice control over the center, get the bishop here, so all factors actually favor black here. And white decides to castle to get the king to safety, but now g5, and black expands on the king side here, not only to get some potential king, a king side attack, but just to gain more space and clamp down on white's position. So now we can see that if we enter an endgame, this extra space would mean a lot. So now king h1, getting the knight out of the pin, c6, defending the center, very logical so far, knight c3, increasing the pressure towards against the center, but now we see that this whole maneuver of knight d1 and the knight c3 was kind of lackluster. It's very uninspiring. And so now bishop g6, just improving the position. And kind of, we see that, first off, black also frees up this pawn, this h6 pawn, to be able to advance in the future, just as an idea, not now, because it would hang the g5 pawn, but it just improves the bishop as well. And seeing how every static and dynamic feature basically favors black, white decides to go on the aggressive with a4, trying to expand and maybe create some weaknesses on against the black king. But now king b8, very nice prophylactic move, very useful in a lot of positions where we cast along. Essentially in most positions we want to play this prophylactic move. And now a5. So now there's a threat of a6 here, because now if we play, for example, let's just put a random move on the board like, king a8 and a6, and if we get this kind of structure, kind of this has been weakened, like our center is kind of weaker as a result of this, of our pawn not being on b7 anymore, and our light squares have been weakened as a result. So black plays a very important move a6 to prevent the a6 advance, and also giving the bishop some room on a7 if needed. So now knight e4. So white wants to establish a knight on b6, and if they can do that, then they'd possibly be doing quite well. So black parries that threat with queen c7, defending against the threat. So now knight b6 would just lose a pawn. And so white is really insistent on putting a knight on b6, but they play queen b4 here. Now possible is to play the move c5, but I think that this is not a move that Rubinstein would go for. Exchanging his advantage of the strong center for a mobile pawn center and trying to go for the initiative on this side of the board. I think that he is more of a player to try to keep the small advantages, and so he decides to play the very nice move queen d6. And I think a lot of players can learn from this decision, because I think a lot of people would avoid the queen exchange because they're afraid that in the endgame it's going to be too close to a draw. But that's so far from the reality. Like every single factor, as we mentioned, for example, the bishop here, the strong center, the extra space, it all favors black. So this endgame is very difficult for white to defend. After takes, c3, kicking the bishop back to a7, and now bishop c2. So trying to potentially expand with b4 here. And we see that this knight is now kind of more offside than it is useful. So yeah, the only way to try to get this knight into the game is either bringing the knight to b2 by playing b4, or bringing the knight to c3 by playing c4. And so knight d7 was played, and this is a nice move because first off, it controls more squares on this side of the board, and also frees up the f-pawn to be able to advance and support the center. And secondarily, and also another idea is that because we see that this piece is kind of bad on f6, like on f6 it really isn't doing much. It's kind of being dominated by this f3 pawn, and also this e4 pawn, kind of not giving black's knight any squares. So knight d7 is nice. Rook a to e1, and now black has kind of a very nice position. They can play a lot of moves. They can play f6 to defend the center, or they can also expand with h5, getting more space. And this is very logical so far. Just increasing the advantage slightly, and after knight d1, f6 was played, defending the center, and knight e3. So white has kind of improved the position slightly, but it's kind of tough to find to find a new idea here. So black plays rook d8, to develop the rook, and now b4. So now without looking at the notation on the right side of the screen, if you want to kind of pause the video and try to find the move that Rubinstein played, feel free to do so. So here, noticing that b4 has been played, this weakens the c3 pawn, and so Black initiates a very favorable exchange here. Okay, maybe not a favorable exchange in the sense of this move bishop takes e3, because we saw that this bishop is such a powerful bishop, cutting down on the whole diagonal. But this is a very concrete decision, because after rook takes e3, the idea is to play d4 and create a different advantage. So now you've given up the bishop here, but what has Black gained as a result of this? Rook e to e1 was played, and now d takes e3. And now we see that White has two weaknesses on the board now. The b4 pawn, which can't even advance, and so it's just simply a target, and also this d3 pawn, which is also a target. And so in this position, h4 was played, expanding on the king side as well, preventing the g3 advance, because now it would open up the h file, and now king g1. So trying to improve the king position. But here we see that because there are some holes in White's position, we can try to occupy those squares with a piece. And so Black plays knight f8, improving the knight to e6 and potentially d4 or f4. So king f2, knight e6, and now knight e2 is kind of forced to prevent this, the knight coming to d4, f4. So in this position, c5 is a very good move. Just trying to say that after you take, d3 is going to be lost. So that's also a good decision. But instead, Black decides to play very calm and slowly with bishop e8. And this just improves the bishop ever so slightly, because it wasn't really doing anything on this diagonal now. And so bishop e3, now threatening actually to exchange the knight, which was looking at some juicy squares here, for the bishop. And so Black avoids this exchange with knight c7, and now d3 is hanging, so White plays bishop c4. And now, seeing that this bishop is the glue that holds everything in White's position together, especially this d3 point, and as a result the d file, Black exchanges this bishop with bishop e6, and after rook c2, bishop takes c4. So even though White has now fixed their structure, kind of, Black has transformed their advantage from the weakness on d3 and b4 to now domination over the d file. So now Black plays knight e6, after rook b1, rook d2. So I think again a lot of players would not look into this move because it exchanges the rooks, and kind of a lot of people have this conception that it gets closer to equality. But that, again, that's further from the case. As a result of this exchange, Black is the only one that has an active rook on the board and can even target White's overextended pawns on this side. And it's important to play rook d3 now, because if you don't, then White is going to play rook e3 and exchange the rooks off with rook d2, and then it will be a draw. So now rook d3 is perfectly timed. Rook b2, preventing rook b3 from coming, king c7, c5, and now king d7. So Black again improves the position, and also can look eventually at this side of the board to go for this f5 advance if needed. So that's an additional resource that Black has. g3. And now hg3 is forced, hg3, and now Black spots the perfect time to break through on the king side with g4. So the point is if fg4, then knight g5 comes, and this position falls, because the e4 falls, and then later these double pawns are going to fall, so it's just very bad. So instead, White plays knight g1, and still after knight g5, White is going to lose a pawn no matter what. King e2, rook a3, f4, but this just loses the e4 pawn, and very soon the g3 pawn will also fall. So we see after this position, very soon White resigned. After knight f4, king h1, rook a1, pinning the knight very nicely, rook d2, and king e7, and White simply threw in the towel because there's nothing more to be done, also against the threat of knight h3. So this is a very smooth game. It shows the technique and very logical play that Rubinstein had, and I think a lot of players can learn from this game, because a lot of people maybe rely on tactics to try to justify their lack of positional understanding or lack of positional play, and as a result they are not improving as chess players. But we can see that this game could have been mistaken for a modern chess master playing a game against you know, a very maybe a weak amateur player. But yeah, like all of the principles that applied like 100 years ago still do apply now, and I think we can learn a lot from these games. So hopefully you also gained a bit of a more appreciation for Rubinstein and his very clean play from start to finish. So yeah, I'm gonna be making another video on this kind of logical chess, showing games of Capablanca and more modern games in the future. So yeah, thanks so much for watching. If you have any comments or questions, please do ask those down below. Thanks so much for watching. See ya.